a writer named Michael Schneerson, who's writing a biography on the dealer Larry Gagosian now, wrote a wonderful encapsulation of that story. And he pretty much, agreed this thing was real. And the point to all this was Joe sued the Warhol estate and the Art Authentication Board, and he lost. What happened was the Warhol people who were wealthy, they hired one of the most expensive high-powered law firms in New York. Allegedly, they were paying him $1,800 an hour, and they ran up a $7 million bill. I mean, I don't know for sure, but this is what the story was. And they snowed Joe's attorney under with motion after motion that they kept filing in court. And eventually, they had to give up. They couldn't compete with these big shot attorneys. And it was a sad story because Joe's painting was real. Briefly, the reason they turned it down was they said it was created off premises. It was not physically created in the studio. But when you get into who Warhol was as an artist, his originality centered around detaching himself from the art-making process. He was quoted as saying he wanted to be a machine. He didn't want to show brushstrokes. He loved using the commercial process, the photo silkscreen, to make art. And people would say, this isn't art. It looks like a newspaper photo. A newspaper photo. But that was the point. He wanted it to do that. He detached himself. He was like an art director. It was a collaborative process. The long and short of that story was there was a gentleman who's still around named Richard Extra, who's in his 90s now, who during the 60s came to Warhol's studio. And Richard owned a movie magazine. And the company Norelco had just come out with this newfangled device called a video camera. And at the time, Andy was making movies. Richard shows up with the video camera. Andy goes wild. He goes, oh my God, I don't have to send the film out to be developed. I can instantly see what I've shot. You can reuse the film. I have to have this. And Richard's like, well, I don't own it, but maybe I can arrange a 6-month loan. They make a deal, and in exchange, Richard ends up with a small group of these red self-portraits, right? And Andy he was sort of cheap. There's no other way to put it. People like to say he was frugal. He was cheap, okay? And when he wasn't getting paid for a painting, what he would do occasionally is job out, the painting, meaning he'd send all the materials over to a silkscreen shop where he'd give them the acetate, the image, the canvas, the paint, the ink, the dimensions, and he'd say, here, run off 7 of these.
I see. Right, so it wasn't necessarily his hand that made the final image.
No, but that was the point. Yeah, that was part of... In other words, authentication is based on intent. What did the artist intend? He intended for these to represent him as paintings of his.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to just jump in here because...
Okay,
wow,
we could go on.
You said a lot. My first thought is like $7 million in attorney's fees. I just think of how many school lunches that could buy. But then also when you say you have this knowledge, and you'll leave it at that, of this painting, I suddenly had this image of like, all those movie scenes where a very rich, well-dressed person is sitting behind a desk and they turn around and like all of a sudden they open a vault there in dim lights in a dark room. There's this like painting that hasn't seen the light of day in years, but I'll leave it at that. I want to get back, so this is a really actually good story about artist intent, and therefore how that intent sort of serves to, interpretation of that intent serves to authenticate art, which then is an important factor in the art market as a whole. Because to me, it sort of is it's a way to, again, grapple with this, like, what does it mean? What does art mean? If people can say, well, it's not really a Warhol because he didn't actually pull the ink over the screen. So I'm going to bring Sebastian Smee into the conversation now. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic at the Washington Post and also author of The Art of Rivalry, 4 Friendships, Betrayals, and Breakthroughs in Modern Art. Sebastian, it's great to talk to you again. And by the way, Sebastian, in my alternative version of the Thomas Crown Affair, I would have cast you in the role that Pierce Brosnan played, but